Hi everyone, my name is Asma. I'm a grant program specialist here at OVW within the TA unit. I work with several of the TA projects and looking forward to getting to know your new FY24 projects as you get started. Today's orientation session will be on adult and virtual learning, led by Abby Larson. Abby is a program manager for learning and leadership at Futures Without Violence, where she supports the ILED TA project. And ILED stands for the Institute for Learning and Educational Development. I've attended several of Abby's trainings, and she is a wonderful presenter. So very happy to have her here. And over to you, Abby.
Thanks so much, Ozma. Hi, everyone. I am Abby, as Ozma said, and I am the project manager for the Institute for Leadership and Education Development. And I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a minute. But first, I want to start with this would you rather question. So, in the chat, if you can share, would you rather be able to remember everything you have ever learned? Or would you rather be able to share everything you currently know with someone else? The catch is that you can only choose one. You're not allowed to choose both. And so if you can, just go ahead and share which one that you would choose in the chat. And I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself in a minute too, but I just wanted to start out with this one. Okay, thank you. I see some folks coming in. Jennifer saying, be able to share everything I currently know. It looks like we have quite a few of those. Oh, no, it's mixed up. Share and be able to remember. Neither. Okay, Margaret is sort of cheating. All right, so for those of you who said that you'd rather be able to share everything you ever learned, can you say a little bit about why you chose that in the chat? And then same for those of you who would rather remember everything. Let's see. It's too overwhelming to remember everything. I was just going to say while you all are typing that I would share what my choice is. And I think I would choose that I would be able to remember everything that I have ever learned. Just because lately I feel like I have been more forgetful than usual. And I just feel like I've learned a lot of interesting things throughout my life, and it would be great to be able to retain that. Although it comes with the caveat of there being many things that I'm definitely glad that I don't remember on a regular basis. Lisa's adding that remembering everything develops wisdom. Cool. And Kathy, thank you for coming on the other side. I love sharing to help others, and I always end up learning from others as well. Yes, and if you remembered everything, you would never lose anything, and that if you remembered everything, you might still be able to share with somebody else in another way. So kind of a way to choose both. I like that creativity. Okay, thank you for entertaining me with that. I like to start out with questions like this. It's in different trainings because it's an example of what's called an activate activity. And so just giving you all a peek behind the curtain with education design is, it can be helpful to ask your learners something that might pique their interest in what you're going to be talking about that day or what you're going to be covering, or just a way to start the session without launching right into all the logistics of like your project or the history or something, finding a way to get people engaged in the room to start. So thank you for doing that. And now that we've done that, I do want to tell you a little bit more about the project though that I'm coming from. So the Institute for Leadership and Education Development is a training and technical assistance provider for Office on Violence Against Women grantees. And we really offer support around anything to do with curriculum design or facilitation skills. So some of those examples I'll go to in more detail at the end of today, but just to give you an idea, we offer webinars on things like facilitation challenges that you might have. This webinar today is an example of a pretty common offering that we do for our technical assistants for grantees. We also do in-person workshops where we go into the building blocks of writing a curriculum, how to facilitate that curriculum, and oftentimes ask participants to build out their own curriculum that they then practice facilitating and can get some feedback on too. I really love this project because I come from a background of sexual violence advocacy and domestic violence for about 10 years, I'd say, before joining Futures. I worked in a number of rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters where I managed the sexual assault counselor training or the domestic violence counselor training. And I was put into a position of having to do training and education, but didn't have a background in education myself. I knew how to be an advocate, how to do direct service. I had some of those basic skills, but really had to learn on the job and over the years of what my values were around education, how to engage people, make sure that their experiences were coming into the room. And so I love that in our ILED project, we call a lot of what we do the accidental educator, because I think that a lot of us really fall into that category where we've, been put into a position of educating others, even though maybe our skill set is really around advocacy or providing legal support or any of the other myriad places that many of us come from who end up in this field of training and technical assistance. Something else that's really important about ILED is that we really feel strongly about having experiential learning. And so you'll never go to an ILED training where we just talk at you the entire time. So I'm hoping that as we go through today, you continue to be prepared to share in some polls and share in the chat. And anytime, if you come to one of our in-person events or another more specialized workshop, we really do a lot of breakout rooms and talking with each other and building on the experience of the people in the room so that, we can respond to what your actual need is and be able to be responsive to that. So today, I'm hoping that we can end our session where you might feel better able to consider how you can adapt your own training design to incorporate core principles of adult learning, as well as start to integrate the needs of your learners into an engaging education design. And so in order to start with that, I'd love to hear just from those of you about who do trainings, or maybe you're planning on doing trainings and you haven't started yet, what your educational philosophy is. How do you want to approach the way that you design education? And it's okay if you don't have something fully fleshed out, but just like how do you think about designing education for other people? John saying that it's accessible to everyone in the target audience. Yeah, I mean, it's very important that people are able to meaningfully participate in what we're offering. Lisa's adding that it's interactive and engaging. Diana also agrees with that they need to be able to engage so they can apply what they're learning and stay focused, especially for longer trainings. I'm seeing a lot of folks adding in interactive, not too word heavy, content heavy, experiential, letting people test out their practical skills. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of us are on the same page about this, of the importance of really bringing in our audience, making sure it's interactive, accessible. Relationship building is a really big piece of that. And then following up after the training too. So knowing that learning is not a one and done experience, right? It takes continuation over time. You might have to revisit it. You might have to refresh your memory because not all of us remember everything we've ever learned, right? Most of us don't. So now, just to further build on what some of you all have already been saying, I'm going to read this quote, and I would love for you to share in the chat what this means to you as someone who designs education. Adults have many years of experience pretending to be students, going through the motions, eyes on the lecturer, while the mind is a million miles away. Real learning happens when people decide to be real. I'll type it in the chat for you too. What does this quote mean to you and the way you design? How do I know what I'm teaching is actually reaching the attendee? Yeah, I think oftentimes we equate silence with everybody understands or is on the same page. And really, that might mean that they're lost, they're in a totally different world. Maybe they completely disagree and it is not resonating at all. And so, what are some more affirmative ways that we can figure out if our learners are with us? Caitlin's adding up most of us spent our entire childhood or young adulthood zoning out in class, but we really don't learn until we actually want to. And when we need to learn the info or when we're doing it on the job. Yeah, we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Yeah, supporting other people where they are and what they want to learn. So really, yeah, just like you all were saying before too, like a tuning into what does your audience need? What do they actually want to know? And yeah, thank you, Lisa, for adding being authentic in the education approach. So really creating an environment where learners feel like it's okay to be wrong, maybe, or it's okay to share some of those rough draft thoughts. They don't have to know everything already in order to meaningfully participate in the space. Being able to be who they really are and show up and maybe even say when they disagree or when they're not following or they're confused. We know that a big piece of learning, or a big barrier, I guess, that gets in the way of learning is a lot of the anxiety that many of us feel in educational settings. And especially going back to what Caitlin pointed out around our experiences with K-12 education, we're often taught just to sit down, be quiet, absorb what the teacher is telling us. As if we are an empty container to be, have information deposited into. And so when you're used to being conditioned that way, you're not necessarily approaching a learning environment where it feels like you can be your real authentic self. It's more of a socially conditioned state of who you've been told that you need to be in that space. And so, what can we do when we are kind of working against a lot of that social conditioning that people have faced their entire lives to break down some of that, not just anxiety, but even resistance sometimes to participating or really feeling like they necessarily want to engage with us too. Let's see, I'm going to summarize Caitlin's comment and then we'll keep moving. So, yes, exactly. Some of the educational experiences or the best educational experiences were where there was no dumb questions, and the classes where you don't really learn in are the ones where it felt like the professor expected us to understand what was going on. Yeah, I definitely resonate with that too. Really feeling the safety in the space of like I can say I don't agree or I don't know what's going on, or even asking a question that kind of shows that I don't understand. So I touched on some of this already about our educational philosophy at ILED, but we really feel strongly around not, like I said, lecturing. We really want to bring in self-reflection and evaluation from the participants or the learners. So really thinking about not only what the content means, but what does this mean for me as a learner? What does it mean for my life, for my experiences, for what I'm trying to do? And what is the need that is trying to be met too? Like, why do I want to learn this? Why is this important to me? Is this relevant to my work and my life? And then also the relationship building piece too. We know that people really learn in connection to others. We learn from other people. We learn by talking about it. We learn by the emotions that we're feeling when we're in a space with other people. So if I feel like I feel really understood and seen and heard, that is also going to stick with me in relationship to the content, more so than if I'm, just kind of sitting there going through the motions, maybe feeling like I don't feel comfortable to ask a question in this space. So, saw this graphic recently, and I just think that it's a cute way to sort of further demonstrate this point that we've all been making around thinking about how we can engage our learners, and that it's really not about this idea that as an educator or a teacher that you are the all-knowing one that whose job it is to deposit information into someone else's brain so they can go on to repeat it, but really lighting that passion inside of them for learning and growing based on what their interests are, what needs they have, what they're trying to do. So we're going to do a series of 3 polls now. And so the first one, I would love to hear how you personally typically approach learning a new skill. So when you want to learn how to be able to do something, maybe not just know about something, but really do something, a new skill, how do you typically approach it? Do you dive in and learn as you go? Do you like to research and prepare first? Do you ask others for tips, resources, maybe how they went about it? Do you take a structured step-by-step approach? Listen to a lecture? And then if none of these options are resonating with you, please feel free to share in the chat or just select the other option. Okay, we'll do just a little bit more time. We've got a little over half of you have participated so far. And I also forgot to note, you should be able to select as many that apply to you. So maybe you do listen to a lecture, but you also pair that in with diving in and learning as you go. Listen to it while you're feeling it out. Maybe you ask others for tips and resources, but you also do your own research and prepare first. Okay. It's like most of you have participated, so just gonna share the results. And it looks pretty evenly split across the board, which, makes sense. There's a lot of different ways to learn a new skill. It's really helpful to mix up some of those ways that you go about it. Um, let's go to the next poll. And let's see, I got to go to the next slide. Okay, so now I want to know what's your biggest motivation for learning something new? And I feel like some of you have already spoke to this in the chat, but let's hear if that's around maybe improving your career spot prospects, growing in your role, for personal satisfaction or growth. Maybe it's to solve a specific problem, to connect with others in the field or in your community or other. Oh, actually, it looks like we don't have an other option on the Zoom piece. So if there's something you want to add in the chat, please feel free. Okay, we can share this one. So also pretty evenly split across the board, which makes sense. As some of you already noted, taking into account with adult education, we come to learning with a specific problem, with a goal in mind, with with a gap in our skill set that we want to improve. But also there's this social piece that's very important for most of us too, right? So it might not just be about, I need to learn how to write a curriculum, but I also want to connect with other people in the field who are thinking about better ways to reach their community through gender-based violence education and how they're doing it too. So let's go to our last poll, number 3, and share what your biggest barrier to learning effectively is. So is that a lack of time, maybe difficulty concentrating, information overload? Is it having kind of unclear learning goals? not being able to remember everything that you've ever learned. So forgetting everything very quickly. Maybe you go to a training and then when someone asks you what you learned a week later, you don't really remember a whole lot. Maybe it's the accessibility or the relatability of the content makes it challenging. And then other if you feel like sharing in the chat. Okay, let's go ahead and share these results too. So, also spread across the board, although I do think it's interesting that difficulty concentrating has about 67% of you who agreed to that one. And if you'd like, please share in the chat why you chose that one. I will guess that a lot of that also has to do with the way that much of our education is designed too. So, really not necessarily bringing learners in, but expecting us to take in maybe too much information at once without sort of bringing us into that experience, having the opportunity to try it out for yourself, doing it side by side with someone else or having a social aspect, but really, trying to read, let's say, a textbook and be able to absorb all of it, or having, somebody sharing very information heavy slides that are full of just a lot that, maybe takes a little bit too much time to absorb. And so the temptation to scroll Instagram or check your email becomes a little bit too tempting. And I see also due to a hidden disability too. Yeah, so that also can be a huge factor. Difficulty concentrating. There's, ADHD, for example, can make that really challenging, other hidden disabilities as well. I see some agreement in the chat, especially for women who are not typically diagnosed with ADHD, or maybe it happens much later in life. So you've just struggled with concentrating for a long time, but maybe not necessarily had access to the tools that could be helpful for you to address that barrier a little bit more. So let's go into this. And I think that we don't have to cover all of these because you all have covered many of them already. But just really dialing this into some of what are the core elements of adult learning. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just a list of elements that I wanted to bring to you all, but I'd say there's, you know, at least a few more that we could talk about too. So I think that we've covered learners have goals, really thinking about what we're trying to do for a training also needs to align with what our audience is there for too. So this even ties into the idea of accountability as an element of adult learning too, and not accountability necessarily in the sense that, somebody said something harmful and is accountable for the impact of what they said, which is a part of, creating safety in a learning environment. But accountability in this context is more about, if I say that I'm doing a webinar on learning about learning, but then you learners come to the webinar and then it actually ends up being more about uh, neuroscience of the brain and how it responds to certain stimuli around, I don't know, around learning. That's not a very good example, but if it ends up being about something that's like loosely related, but not really what you came there for, that's going to create an issue just for people who came with a specific goal in mind and probably a clear need for a skill that they would like to further develop. Safety and multi-partiality is also really important. And I think many of you, if not everybody in the room, I think understands how important safety is, particularly in education that involves gender-based violence and interconnecting issues of social justice and equity. Um, so I think that, having that trauma-informed piece where we think about what our content is going to be and what sort of supports we have in place for learners, how we can navigate that anxiety, the issue of, many people probably have hidden disabilities, who might have disabilities that we are aware of, but we're not necessarily accommodating for. That can all impact the safety of a learner in the space if they're not feeling like their needs were attended to. Safety also, though, really speaks to what Caitlin was bringing into the chat earlier and what I was saying about feeling like there are no quote unquote dumb questions and that you as a learner are able to engage with the content in a way that is authentic to you. And so I think that it's important too to create a space where we are able to have dialogue, disagreement, and even sometimes conflict that can be worked out and talked through, because otherwise you just have people who may shut down and sit out and dissociate, and they really haven't been able to participate in the learning and maybe are just once again going through those motions to get through it. Uh, a key piece with this, though, that is really important is multi-partiality, which is one of my new favorite words just from some of the recent restorative justice work that I've been doing. And basically, the idea of multi-partiality is, you know, giving everybody in the room a voice and not shaming necessarily, but you're also, or excuse me, it's not about shaming learners, but you're also making sure that you are not only highlighting dominant narratives too, so that you are giving equal voice to narratives, perspectives, worldviews that are often marginalized or cast off to the side or not given the same sort of weight or importance in an educational environment. And so, really thinking about how you, as a facilitator of adult learning, are helping support people to bring in their experiences that don't all necessarily perfectly align with a status quo or a dominant narrative. Social, we've really covered already. I think it's just the importance of peer learning and really being able to talk with other people in an educational setting and not necessarily just with the facilitator, but with each other as well. Praxis is action with reflection. So that's the doing piece, doing it as you go, practicing, but also having some reflection about it as well. So it's really this dance of doing, reflecting, deciding maybe how it works for you, changing it a little bit, and then new doing based on some of that practice and reflection. So figuring out how you can incorporate that into your sessions of let me find a way for everyone to put this into place, but also think about how it worked for them, what they might change differently next time, and then try it again. And then ongoing is the last one. Really, training is not a one and done event. It's something that we want to embed as a lifelong learning process, something that you revisit over time, that you practice, that you come back to, and not just attend a one-time webinar. So before we keep moving, I'd love if any of these are sticking out to you as something where, it's ringing a bell for you, like, oh, I always do this in my trainings or in my education design, and this is how. So if anybody wants to share anything like that with the group, please do in the chat. How do you create safety in a group? How do you lift up non-dominant narratives or maybe approach learning in a way that challenges some of the social conditioning we all experienced in our K-12 education? How do you bring in self-reflection? It's kind of a big question too. So I'm gonna, just in case someone's still typing, I'm gonna give you a second to do that while I take a drink of my water. Let's see. Simone likes to take high level theory and make it relatable. Yeah, I love that. So, really breaking it down to, okay, we have this concept up here, but how does this relate to your life, to what you're doing, maybe to your experiences? How is it different? What is, what might be another way of looking at this? What's a way to kind of make this a little bit more bite-sized or understandable? Diana's saying clear goals, so really putting the objective up front in a presentation and build the training around those objectives. I love that. We will also talk about that in a few minutes. Carrie likes to create safety by starting out asking the obvious questions myself to the group so that I've not only said that this is a safe space, but demonstrated it. Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, saying that something is a safe space and really actually creating that environment there can be a big difference between that sometimes. Great. Okay, feel free to keep sharing, but I'm gonna keep us moving along. Okay. And so getting into, so how do we actually do this? We have a design process where we really want to start out with, well, what is our goal for designing this education session? And the way that I answer that question is by thinking about what is the problem you're trying to solve with education? So not necessarily what is a problem in general, but why am I choosing to solve this problem with education? Because not every problem can be addressed with education. There are many, I think sometimes we want training, especially in our field, to be like the end all be all of like, okay, well, let's just answer that by, you know, training them to do it better, to be better about it. And it's not necessarily always going to have the results that we want it to. And so really thinking about, all right, what is in our locus of control here? What can we do with this by way of education? And so in order to do that, we also want to evaluate those needs too, right? So what is the problem and what are the needs here? And then so how can we develop our goal based on that? And then I would say, as we're thinking about that too, considering a power analysis as well. So, who says that I'm the one who gets to decide what the answer is to this problem or this need and this question and what the right way is to do it? I really love this quote from a toolkit created by Comunar Latino on transformational collaboration, which I will share in the chat with you all in just a second, but I'm going to read it first. So, power includes the ability to decide what a problem is, to decide what needs to be done about it, to decide who will be included to solve it, in what capacity, and with what resources. And I just really love this quote specifically in this context because I think that it speaks to how, you know, the temptation to decide what needs to be done by an issue because you have identified it is very strong, but always bringing it back to, okay, well, what if my solution to this problem, one has already, there's already been a lot of thinking around, and what can I do to see what already exists out there before I decide that I'm the one and only who needs to do this? And also, what if that's not actually the way that everyone who is impacted by this issue would address this too? So what can I do to, not only figure out what I think the need is, but also figure out, what do the learners think their need is, but also the people who will be impacted by that learning identify as their needs. And so, it's not even just doing a needs assessment with people who are in your potential audience of what they want to know or they need to know or skills they need to develop, but it's also figuring out how to find out the people who will be impacted by it. So, for example, if your training is for service providers and that's your audience, but ultimately the education is about supporting survivors in a more holistic or culturally responsive way, we probably want to talk to survivors about what they want the service providers to know or the field to know about how to better provide that support, right? And like I said, we also want to figure out what already exists out there too, because I think, especially sometimes in white Western dominant education spaces, we might think that we're the first ones to come up with with a concept when really there's been a lot of thinking that's already been happening about that over time, and we're not really resourcing the expertise or the thoughts or all of the work that's already been happening. And so really thinking about how can we bring in what's already happening, how can we bring in the people who will be impacted and the learners into the way that we design the education. So give me just one second. I want to share that toolkit with you all before I keep moving, because otherwise I might forget. And it's really great for, um, I think, purposes of designing programs generally too, not just educational programs, and thinking about the way that you partner with other groups as well. So there's that. Okay, so we are moving along in our process. We have, let's say, we've identified a need, we have done a needs assessment, and we've decided that we are, now at the point where we're designing an education session. How are we going to know if somebody understands what we're training them on? How does somebody demonstrate understanding? How do I know if you know their use of the information, so how they put it into practice? If you give them an activity for them to apply what they've learned through interactive exercises, pre and post workshop trainings, so follow up, maybe that's a survey too, taking it and applying it to a situation in their own life. If the audience is answering questions, having discussion about it. Yeah, and the point I'm trying to make here too is everything that you all have shared fits under this category of understand. So when we're building out education sessions, we want not only want to think about like, okay, I want participants to understand how to provide culturally relevant domestic violence advocacy. How am I going to know that they understand how to do that? Is it because they're taking what they learned and applying it in their role as an advocate? Is it because I shared a post-workshop survey with them and they answered some questions reflecting on what that means to them in their context? Is it because we did an activity and I saw them, maybe even acting out an interaction with a survivor in a role play, taking consideration for, some of the different barriers and challenges or concerns that they had. And so before I get into more of like how to actually develop an objective that speaks to the specificities of understanding, I just want to differentiate between a goal and an objective because I think they often get conflated. So the what I think is a really helpful way to remember the difference is that goal has the word go in it. So this is thinking big, thinking abstract. Where are you trying to get to ultimately? So once you solve this problem with education, where does that mean that we'll be? So goals are long-term aims that you want to accomplish. And then objectives has the word object in it. So objectives are concrete steps to reach your goal. It's something that you can hold in your hand. I can hold in my hand that I mean, I guess not literally, but I can hold in my hand when I witness the audience answering questions that demonstrate that they have an understanding of culturally relevant responses to domestic violence. I can hold it in my hand when I see participants do a role play where they're demonstrating the skills that I was upbringing as a piece of doing culturally relevant domestic violence advocacy. And so Bloom's taxonomy, I think, is a really helpful tool when we're thinking about not only what our objective is going to be and how we're going to be really specific about how it's going to be something that I, as a designer, can hold in my hand, know that the learners are able to do it, that I have achieved my objective, but also thinking about, is it reasonable that as a result of attending this 90-minute webinar on adult learning, that then somebody who is participating right now who's maybe never designed education before would then be able to go on and create their own training on adult learning? Probably not necessarily, and at least not only with what they remember from this webinar and using the slides. You would probably have to engage in some learning after the fact, doing maybe some of your own research, your own structured development around figuring out how you might design that training. And so when I think about learning objectives for, let's say, a shorter webinar, I'm probably going to stay more on this left side of the slide where I'm thinking about, okay, what do I want people to be able to recall as a result of attending today, or maybe examine. So I might want you to be able to walk away from today explaining what some of those core elements are of adult learning and maybe discussing how those apply to the way that you've already been designing your education. And so I'm going to share a handout with you all in the chat that is one that we use for ILED on helping develop learning objectives, just because we're not going to go too in depth in them today. Let's see, just a second.
I can share it for you, Abby.
Oh, thanks, Brianne. I actually am very close to it right now. Did I share it with you? Oh, I did. Actually, yeah, Brianne, maybe if you, oh wait, no, never mind. There it is. Okay. So I use that. I just think that it's really helpful to refer back to Bloom's taxonomy when I'm even actually writing the learning objectives too, and thinking about, okay, I actually have 3 days though now to talk about the way that people learn and how to design education. So I am going to ask learners to create their own curriculum design, and I'm going to ask them to uh, practice facilitating that. So they're going to be more on the right side of this slide here, where they are analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And one more quick note that I'll make about this too is Bloom's taxonomy is hierarchical in the sense that it builds on itself. So we probably can't, like I said, create a curriculum without first recalling, some of the basic pieces around what goes into adult learning, what goes into curriculum writing, but it doesn't mean that recall, examine, apply, that these are lesser forms of knowledge. It just means that they're more the foundational aspects of knowledge that you can then build on to be able to evaluate and create something of your own. So once we have our overall goal and our objectives, we want to think about how we're actually going to get there. And one of you pointed this out earlier too, is, you start out with your objectives and you really use those as a tool to think about, well, how am I going to design this? So based on my objective, would doing a webinar about this be sufficient? Maybe this really does need to be a longer in-person training, at least 2.5, 3 days, or, in the case of becoming a sexual assault counselor, maybe that's 40 hours of training. Is it a toolkit of some kind that might be more helpful to have just easily accessible whenever you need it? For example, like this learning objectives toolkit, I personally feel is potentially more helpful to you than if you were to only listen to me talk about how to write a learning objective, but having something more concrete in front of you that you can use as you practice writing your own learning objectives. Is it technical assistance? So maybe you have a learning objective that you decide that, maybe it would be achieved by providing relevant resources, talking through some questions with someone. Maybe it's a pre-recorded video or a podcast. Really, the world is your oyster. It's just sort of thinking about in order to have my learners achieve this goal and this objective, how am I going to get there? What's going to help them be able to do this, recall this, evaluate this piece of what I'm talking about? And so if, for example, your goal is to change the way that teens who live in rural areas think about their relationships, um, is one webinar going to suffice? Probably not. We might even want to think about if a webinar is even the way to reach that specific audience too. Are they going to even show up in the first place? But if our goal is really changing people's minds, we probably need to think about a way to be a little bit more immersed into their everyday, their communities, or at least create something that's going to be more ongoing than a one-time experience. So with learning objectives, we're really more interested in what they can do. And so our learning objectives should also reflect that. Is it, is it going to be helpful to an advocate to just be able to list some of the dynamics of domestic violence or the different types of domestic violence? What do we want them to be able to do with that information too? And so that's when we would ask ourselves as designers, is this something that the learner would actually do in the real world? And then going back to that piece again of, can I tell when they have done it? So how do I know that they understand? How do I know they can do it? Okay. So now we are going to walk through an example of how we might make something resonate or stick with learners a little bit longer than beyond our 60-minute webinar or 90-minute webinar. So we know that adults learn differently from children, going back to this idea that we really come with a brain full of experiences, ideas, perspectives, biases that we've developed over the years. And so if I show you, for instance, this star cookie cutter, um, and I ask you what it's used for, you're probably going to respond based on some of those experiences and biases you have, right? So if I wanted to change your mind about that, I can ask you, what else do you think that this star cookie cutter could be used to make? And so I am actually going to pose that question to you. What else can this star cookie cutter be used to make? We know that it can probably make star-shaped cookies, but what else? A Christmas ornament. See, a couple people are in the Christmas ornament tip. Pie topper decorations. A star-shaped sandwich. Ooh, I like that. Play-Doh stars. Yeah, okay. So y'all are, you're answering based on your experiences. Maybe some of you, are thinking about the upcoming holidays, and so a star is making you think of a tree topper. Like, oh yeah, I could probably use something other than cookie dough to create a star-shaped tree topper. Or, maybe I don't want to use a cookie at all because I'm not a sweets person, so I'm going to make a star-shaped sandwich or pancakes. Simone's saying you could use it as a teaching tool to recognize shapes. So yeah, maybe even taking it away from even carving out anything at all, but now it's about making shapes. Drawing, tracing a star. Okay, great. Yeah, now you're expanding even a little bit more beyond like using it as a star-shaped cookie to cut out a star shape, but maybe using it in a completely different context. So what if I told you all then that this star cookie cutter can be used to make a fox face or a fox face cookie? Would you know how to do that by looking at this? Does anyone have a picture in their mind of what that might look like? Yes, okay. Maybe you're an artist or a baker or a cookie making aficionado. Caitlin's saying two of the points would be ears. Okay, so you're able to visualize it a little bit. So now let me show you an example. So I think so now everybody has a visual. You're able to connect the idea of a star-shaped cookie to what it might actually look like. But what if now I was to ask you to now go and make a fox cookie using a star-shaped cookie cutter? Would you be able to do it? You can just answer yes or no in the chat if you think you would, based on seeing this photo. Yes, but not well. Caitlin says no, you'd have to just show me how to use fondant. Yes, but not well. Okay, so yeah, you're probably thinking about using this as a reference while you try it on your own. Maybe a couple of you who said that maybe you would have some experience with cookie decorating, or like I said, with doing art or something relevant in your experience that you can then apply to making a fox cookie. So, how does that change then if I gave all of you star-shaped cookies? So, when you joined this workshop, you opened up your packet of star-shaped cookies. I gave you lots of icing in all the right colors. I gave you step-by-step directions. And then we also walked through it together on how we were going to make a fox. Maybe you could periodically show yours in the screen, how it was looking, and ask questions of each other. How many of you then think that you might be better able to make this fox cookie? Caitlin says better, but still not well. Okay, not a lot of confidence. All right, well, maybe my point isn't quite working the way that I had planned, but I was thinking, that we're probably more likely to be able to create that Fox cookie if we're given the tools, the time, the peer support, the ability to, bounce it off of each other and do it together in real time while using the photo as a reference. However, maybe some of you in this group are not bakers. You're not really interested in making a Fox cookie. It's not really something you're interested in. So, you're not really better able to do it because you don't really care, you don't really want to. And so that's also a big piece too. I told you that you were coming to a workshop today about learning, and now I'm asking you to make fox cookies. You might be like, okay, well, I don't really want to make a fox cookie. I'm not interested in that. That's not what I came here for. And so that's also going to have an effect on whether or not you're able to do the task, is if you even want to in the first place. I'm glad at least Melissa would, because there's a love of baking there. So thank you for that. This picture up here on the right is my fox cookie that I made out of memory from doing this exercise actually a couple years ago, although I used a tree-shaped cookie and I only had 60 seconds to do it, so that's why it's a little bit sloppy. But I just added that there for fun for you all to see my version of a fox cookie. So once again, just thinking about stickiness and how our brain learns and retains information, maybe, in order to really get into this fox cookie making, you need some sort of pre-education engagement. So one, need an interest in making fox cookies, but you also might need to watch something about different animal shapes that you can make for cookies or different techniques around cookie decorating in general so that you're prepared when we all come together. Um, We also want learning activities to be problem-centered and include that practice and reinforcement. So I think maybe this speaks to a little bit of why Caitlin was still hesitant around not necessarily being able to still make a fox cookie, even with all the tools, is because we do still need that element of practicing. So maybe the first time you make a fox cookie, it'll look a little bit like mine does here. And then eventually over time with more practice and reinforcement, it looks a little bit more like this picture here, right? And so we also know that brain process is based on analogy. So every new experience that we have is compared to our prior experiences, including the emotions that accompanied them. So this is really part of what I was saying earlier around not only are you going to be thinking about the content of a training, you're also going to be thinking about how you felt when it was happening. I don't know how many of you have really impactful learning experiences in your life where a really big piece of what made that impactful for you was how connected you felt to the group, how, like I said, seen and heard you felt, how able you felt to be your authentic self. Maybe you made a friend out of it. And so that emotional tie in our brain also really strongly connects to our memory of that content and how it resonates with us moving forward. Stickiness or keeping the learning with us also really requires those refreshers and then that social piece too. So you absolutely can learn things independently. People teach themselves skills on their own all the time, but a way to reinforce that really is adding a social aspect to it too. And I think in our work, it's really important to find ways to not only have learners learning in isolation, but finding ways to connect across the field in their community with each other. Um, this I just wanted to add because I always come back to this when I'm designing curriculum is really trying to make sure that whenever I am planning a lecture, that I time it out so that I'm not talking at the group for more than 10 to 15 minutes straight without bringing them into the conversation in some way. So I always want to try to break that up with some level of engagement, like adding in a group discussion if it's, that's not possible here today with a webinar setting, but if we have a meeting or if we're in person, really bringing in that group discussion piece or as you all have been great about doing, participating in the chat, sharing your thoughts, participating in a poll, working through a case study or something around a specific experience or example that a participant is bringing to the group, or some level of self-reflection as well. And so this can be really hard to avoid sometimes, especially for those of you who do trainings on mandatory content, or maybe you're given curricula where there is not a lot of room to add more time for activities. And so I would just say that to the extent that you are able, really trying to bring people in as much as possible and just trying to not talk at people for more than 10 to 15 minutes because most of our attention spans really won't allow for much longer than that before our brain starts to wander other places. And so, that really feeds into what I think is a common mistake that we all make. I still have to remind myself of this almost every day, is that, it's a false assumption that if we, the facilitator, said the words, that the learners understood it. So I've covered a lot of information today, and I might assume that you all absorbed every piece of that just because I said it. But I have to remind myself, one, that learning is an ongoing process. It requires those refreshers. It requires a commitment and a clear need. And so just because I said something doesn't mean that you walked away knowing it. And so this becomes really important too when we're thinking about these very content heavy trainings that we put together, that our learners really are not walking away having absorbed everything that we decided to pack into it in favor of cutting out the activities. Um, Something we do with iLED is we really make sure that we are never cutting our break time. And if we have to cut down content, really trying to prioritize keeping in those activities rather than the content, just, in service of this piece around, just because we said it doesn't mean that you actually absorbed it. And learners are much better able to absorb when they can, you know, take it, think about how it applies to your own context, practice it, and get feedback from each other, ask questions about it. And so just to further drill down that point, just thinking about, the last time you went to a webinar, how long did you remember the details? And so if you didn't follow up and, continue to build that skill or build that muscle, it probably doesn't stick with you very long. You might remember how you felt about it, that it was good, that you liked the speaker, that something they said resonated with you, but you're probably not going to retain all of the information. And so in order to learn, adults really need to do something with that information. Okay, so now I would like you all to just take some time and you can share in the chat if you'd like to, but really I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to think about this on your own. And so no pressure to share in the chat unless you want to. But I want you to think about when you do develop trainings, to what extent are they about you and your interests rather than the learner? And this doesn't mean that, you as a designer or a facilitator are not supposed to bring yourself in or your experiences. In fact, I think that's a very valuable piece of training design. What I mean more so is like when I am really interested by, let's say, the history of this movement, but my audience is there maybe to learn more of a specific skill around like peer counseling. It might be more in my own interest that I add an hour of history for them when really the need that they were there to fill was more around like the counseling skills. And so I'm spending a lot of time on pieces that interest me that weren't necessarily part of the needs assessment or the problem that I'm trying to solve with education. And so it's kind of like in the same way that we talk about being survivor centered or client centered, how we design our education so that it's meeting a need of the learners and engaging what they already know. So with all of that context, let's just take a couple minutes and you all can think that through. And for whoever feels like sharing in the chat, please do. Okay. That may or may not have been enough time. I encourage you all to carry this question forward beyond today too, and just think about this as you are designing trainings. Just, how do I know that this is the need of the learners? How am I being responsive to that? How can I make this really learner centered? So, I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, but I do want to let you all know that we have plenty of time for any questions that you all have about the ILED project or anything we've talked about today. While you think about that, if you want to submit any for me, I'm also going to share my email in the chat so that you can reach out to me. We are a training and technical assistance provider, so we're here for you if you have some curriculum development questions, facilitation question, needs that you'd like to think through with somebody else. That's definitely what we're here for. But while you think about that, I'll share a couple of upcoming events that we have. So our technical assistance is ongoing. We do have a webinar coming up on December 17th that I'm going to share in the chat with you on designing gender-based violence education for older adult learners. And so, we know that the world is aging. I think the aging population is maybe set to double in the next 30 years. And many people in our workplaces, in the field, survivors, people who will be in our audiences are older adults too. And so, how can we think about ways that we design education that meets the needs of older adults and maybe some of the ways that engaging over time changes? So, another opportunity that we have coming up that I do not have too many details about yet because we're still in the approval process with OVW, but we are hoping to host our next effective meeting facilitation skills workshop in spring of next year. This is really around meetings. So maybe those are internal meetings that you facilitate in your organization, or you facilitate coalition building meetings or partnership meetings. It really dives into how you can navigate decision making, addressing power dynamics and conflict, but also even just some of the more basic pieces of meeting facilitation, like having an effective agenda, developing the objectives for that, how you can maybe address different dynamics within the group that can sometimes be challenging, how you can engage all voices. I'm sure we've all been in meetings where there's 10 of us there, but maybe only 2 people talking. And so how, as a facilitator, can you navigate some of those challenges? If you get on our mailing list, you will stay updated with that. I'm hoping to send out the applications for that in February of next year. And then also, this is in the approval process right now, but it's ready to go as soon as it gets the sign off from OVW, is we translated our distance e-learning course to a self-paced course. And so you can register for that as soon as we're able to release it, you can register for that at any time and work through that on your own time, learning how to a little bit more about some of the content that we covered today, but also how you can design virtual courses for maybe your audiences that are engaging, accessible, and use some of the more budget-friendly software platforms too that are also known for accessibility. So yeah, that's about it for right now. And I only see one question. Uh, how do you all get attendance from our clients? Um, we don't necessarily get attendance from your clients. We get attendance from local programs mostly because we're a training and technical assistance provider. We don't really do direct service. So Futures Without Violence doesn't have any departments that are seeing clients, although we do have some offerings that could be open to clients, like some of our national webinars or national workshops or some of the virtual courses we offer, but that's more of a matter of them getting connected through a local program. So we are connected to local programs throughout the US as well as other training and technical assistance providers like yourselves. And then maybe one other piece to this question that I'm pulling out of it is maybe around the needs assessment piece when I said that we want to hear from survivors or people who will be impacted by the education. And I would say part of that is that, over the years, we have built up a network of survivors who we can call on and ideally pay them for their time too, if you're able to, but having that be a part of it and have them participate in curriculum development meetings, listening sessions, focus groups. And so that does require sometimes doing really intentional and targeted outreach with community-based programs who are seeing clients or working with survivors regularly, or sometimes by doing an open call. Okay, and I am not seeing any other questions, so I'm just going to add my email in the chat for you all and close us out with yet another quote that I really love related to education. Paulo Freire, author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, did a lot around popular education, which I would recommend looking up if you're unfamiliar. But he says there's no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. And so I just love holding this quote close to myself as I think about how can I, be on the side of bringing about freedom and justice and, a safe space for people to be themselves. So I'll hand it back over to Ozma. Thank you all so much for being such an excellent audience, and I'm sure we'll cross paths in many different ways. And yeah, it's nice to see you all.
Thank you so much, Abby, for another great presentation. And please feel free to reach out to her and the ILED team if you need any support with adult learning in your programs. Please join us tomorrow at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, for another orientation. Another orientation session. We'll be talking about accessible training and technical assistance, and that session will be led by Activating Change. And thank you also to our captioners and also Brian and Amy for help with the logistics for this event. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.